The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. 1. On the 25th of March, 18, a very strange occurrence took place in St. Petersburg. On the Ascension Avenue there lived a barber by the name of Ivan Yakovlevich. He had lost his family name, and on his signboard, on which was depicted the head of a gentleman with one cheek soaped, the only inscription to be read was, "Bloodletting done here." On this particular morning he woke pretty early. Becoming aware of the smell of fresh-baked bread, he sat up a little and saw his wife, who had a special partiality for coffee, in the act of taking some fresh-baked bread out of the oven. "Today, Praskovna Osipovna," he said, "I do not want any coffee. I should like a fresh loaf with onions." "The blockhead may eat bread only as far as I'm concerned," said his wife to herself. "Then I shall have a chance of getting some coffee." And she threw a loaf on the table. For the sake of propriety, Ivan Yakovlevich drew a coat over his shirt, sat down at the table, shook out some salt for himself, prepared 2 onions, assumed a serious expression, and began to cut the bread. After he had cut the loaf in 2 halves, he looked, and to his great astonishment, saw something whitish sticking in it. He carefully poked round it with his knife and felt it with his finger. "Quite firmly fixed," he murmured in his beard. "What can it be?" He put in his finger and drew out a nose. Ivan Yakovlevich at first let his hands fall from sheer astonishment. Then he rubbed his eyes and began to feel it. A nose, an actual nose, and, moreover, it seemed to be the nose of an acquaintance. Alarm and terror were depicted in Ivan's face, but these feelings were slight in comparison with the disgust which took possession of his wife. "Whose nose have you cut off, you monster?" she screamed, her face red with anger. "You scoundrel, you tippler! I myself will report you to the police. Such a rascal! Many customers have told me that while you were shaving them, you held them so tight by the nose that they could hardly sit still." But Ivan Yakovlevich was more dead than alive. He saw at once that this nose could belong to no other than to Kovalov, a member of the municipal committee, whom he shaved every Saturday and Wednesday. "Stop, Praskovna Osipovna. I will wrap it in a piece of cloth and place it in the corner. There it may remain for the present. Later on, I will take it away." "No, not there. Shall I endure an amputated nose in my room? You understand nothing except how to strop a razor. You know nothing of the duties and obligations of a respectable man. You vagabond, you good-for-nothing. Am I to undertake all responsibility for you at the police office? Ah, you soap-smearer, you blockhead. Take it away where you like, but don't let it stay under my eyes." Ivan Yakovlevich stood there flabbergasted. He thought, and knew not what he thought. "The devil knows how that happened," he said at last, scratching his head behind his ear. "Whether I came home drunk last night or not, I really don't know, but in all probability this is a quite extraordinary occurrence. For a loaf is something baked, and a nose is something different. I don't understand the matter at all." And Ivan Yakovlevich was silent. The thought that the police might find him in unlawful possession of a nose and arrest him robbed him of all presence of mind. Already he began to have visions of a red collar with silver braid and of a sword, and he trembled all over. At last he finished dressing himself, and to the accompaniment of the emphatic exhortations of his spouse, he wrapped up the nose in a cloth and issued into the street. He intended to lose it somewhere, either at somebody's door, or in a public square, or in a narrow alley, but just then, in order to complete his bad luck, he was met by an acquaintance, who showered inquiries upon him. "Hello, Ivan Yakovlevich, whom are you going to shave so early in the morning?" etc., so that he could find no suitable opportunity to do what he wanted. Later on he did let the nose drop, but a sentry bore down upon him with his halberd and said, "Look out, you've let something drop," and Ivan Yakovlevich was obliged to pick it up and put it in his pocket. A feeling of despair began to take possession of him, all the more as the streets became more thronged and the merchants began to open their shops. At last he resolved to go to the Isaac Bridge, where perhaps he might succeed in throwing it into the Neva. But my conscience is a little uneasy that I have not yet given any detailed information about Ivan Yakovlevich, an estimable man in many ways. Like every honest Russian tradesman, Ivan Yakovlevich was a terrible drunkard, and although he shaved other people's faces every day, his own was always unshaved. His coat, he never wore an overcoat, was quite mottled. That is, it had been black, but become brownish-yellow. The collar was quite shiny, and instead of the 3 buttons, only the threads by which they had been fastened were to be seen. Ivan Yakovlevich was a great cynic, and when Kovalev, the member of the municipal committee, said to him, as was his custom while being shaved, "Your hands always smell, Ivan Yakovlevich," the latter answered, "What do they smell of?" "I don't know, my friend, but they smell very strong." Ivan Yakovlevich, after taking a pinch of snuff, would then, by way of reprisals, set to work to soap him on the cheek, the upper lip, behind the ears, on the chin, and everywhere. This worthy man now stood on the Isaac Bridge. At first he looked round him, then he leant on the railings of the bridge as though he wished to look down and see how many fish were swimming past, and secretly threw the nose, wrapped in a little piece of cloth, into the water. He felt as though a ton weight had been lifted off him, and laughed cheerfully. Instead, however, of going to shave any officials, he turned his steps to a building, the signboard of which bore the legend, "Teas served here," in order to have a glass of punch, when suddenly he perceived at the other end of the bridge a police inspector of imposing exterior, with long whiskers, 3-cornered hat, and a sword hanging at his side. He nearly fainted, but the police inspector beckoned to him with his hand and said, "Come here, my dear sir." Ivan Yakovlevich, knowing how a gentleman should behave, took his hat off quickly, went towards the police inspector and said, "I hope you are in the best of health." "Never mind my health. Tell me, my friend, why you were standing on the bridge." "By heaven, gracious sir, I was on the way to my customers and only looked down to see if the river was flowing quickly." "That is a lie. You won't get out of it like that. Confess the truth." I'm willing to shave your grace 2 or even 3 times a week, gratis," answered Ivan Yakovlevich. "No, my friend, don't put yourself out. 3 barbers are busy with me already, and reckon it a high honour that I let them show me their skill. Now then, out with it. What were you doing there?" Ivan Yakovlevich grew pale, but here the strange episode vanishes in mist, and what further happened is not known. 2. Kovalev, the member of the municipal committee, awoke fairly early that morning and made a droning noise, brrr, brrr, through his lips, as he always did, though he couldn't say why. He stretched himself and told his valet to give him a little mirror which was on the table. He wished to look at the heat boil which had appeared on his nose the previous evening, but to his great astonishment he saw that instead of his nose he had a perfectly smooth vacancy in his face. Thoroughly alarmed, he ordered some water to be brought and rubbed his eyes with a towel. Sure enough, he had no longer a nose. Then he sprang out of bed and shook himself violently. No nose any more. He dressed himself and went at once to the police superintendent. But before proceeding further, we must certainly give the reader some information about Kovalev, so that we may know what sort of a man this member of the municipal committee really was. These committee men, who obtain the title by means of certificates of learning, must not be compared with the committee men appointed for the Caucasus district, who are of a quite different kind. The learned committee man, but Russia is such a wonderful country that when one committee man is spoken of, all the others from Riga to Kamchatka refer it to themselves. The same is also true of all other titled officials. Kovalev had been a Caucasian committee man 2 years previously, and could not forget that he had occupied that position. But in order to enhance his own importance, he never called himself committee man, but major. "Listen, my dear," he used to say when he met an old woman in the street who sold shirt fronts. "Go to my house in Sadovaya Street and ask, 'Does Major Kovalev live here?' Any child can tell you where it is." Accordingly, we will call him for the future Major Kovalev. It was his custom to take a daily walk on the Nevsky Avenue. The collar of his shirt was always remarkably clean and stiff. He wore the same style of whiskers as those that are worn by governors of districts, architects, and regimental doctors. In short, all those who have full red cheeks and play a good game of whist. These whiskers grow straight across the cheek towards the nose. Major Kovalev wore a number of seals, on some of which were engraved armorial bearings, and others the names of the days of the week. He had come to St. Petersburg with the view of obtaining some position corresponding to his rank, if possible that of vice-governor of a province, but he was prepared to be content with that of a bailiff in some department or other. He was, moreover, not disinclined to marry, but only such a lady who could bring with her a dowry of over 200,000 roubles. Accordingly, the reader can judge for himself what his sensations were when he found in his face, instead of a fairly symmetrical nose, a broad, flat vacancy. To increase his misfortune, not a single droshky was to be seen in the street, and so he was obliged to proceed on foot. He wrapped himself up in his cloak and held his handkerchief to his face as though his nose bled. But perhaps it's all in my imagination. It's impossible that a nose should drop off in such a silly way, he thought, and stepped into a confectioner's shop in order to look into the mirror. Fortunately, no customer was in the shop. Only small shop boys were cleaning it out and putting chairs and tables straight. Others, with sleepy faces, were carrying fresh cakes on trays, and yesterday's newspapers stained with coffee were still lying about. "Thank God no one's here," he said to himself. "Now I can look at myself leisurely." He stepped gingerly up to a mirror and looked. "What an infernal face!" he exclaimed, and spat with disgust. "If there were only something there instead of the nose! But there's absolutely nothing." He bit his lips with vexation, left the confectioner's, and resolved, quite contrary to his habit, neither to look nor smile at anyone on the street. Suddenly he halted as if rooted to the spot before a door where something extraordinary happened. A carriage drew up at the entrance. The carriage door was opened, and a gentleman in uniform came out and hurried up the steps. How great was Kovalev's terror and astonishment when he saw that it was his own nose! At this extraordinary sight, everything seemed to turn round with him. He felt as though he could hardly keep upright on his legs, but though trembling all over as though with fever, he resolved to wait till the nose should return to the carriage. After about 2 minutes the nose actually came out again. It wore a gold-embroidered uniform with a stiff high collar, trousers of chamois leather, and a sword hung at its side. The hat, adorned with a plume, showed that it held the rank of a state councillor. It was obvious that it was paying duty calls. It looked round on both sides, called to the coachman, "Drive on!" and got into the carriage, which drove away. Poor Kovalev nearly lost his reason. He didn't know what to think of this extraordinary procedure. And indeed, how was it possible that the nose, which only yesterday was on his face, and which could neither walk nor drive, should wear a uniform? He ran after the carriage, which fortunately had stopped a short way off before the Grand Bazaar of Moscow. He hurried towards it and pressed through a crowd of beggar women with their faces bound up, leaving only 2 openings for the eyes, over whom he had formerly so often made merry. There were only a few people in front of the bazaar. Kovalev was so agitated that he could decide on nothing, and looked for the nose everywhere. At last he saw it, standing before a shop. It seemed half buried in its stiff collar and was attentively inspecting the wares displayed. "How can I get at it?" thought Kovalev. "Everything, the uniform, the hat, and so on, show that it is a state councillor. How the deuce has that happened?" He began to cough discreetly near it, but the nose paid him not the least attention. "Honourable sir," said Kovalev at last, plucking up courage. "Honourable sir." "What do you want?" asked the nose, and turned round. "It seems strange to me, most respected sir. You should know where you belong, and I find you all of a sudden—" "Where? Judge yourself." "Pardon me, I do not understand what you're talking about. Explain yourself more distinctly." How shall I make my meaning plainer to him? Then, plucking up fresh courage, he continued, "Naturally, besides I am a major, you must admit it's not befitting that I should go about without a nose. An old apple woman on the Ascension Bridge may carry on her business without one, but since I am on the lookout for a post, besides, in many houses, I am acquainted with ladies of high position, Madame Tchektiriev, wife of a state councillor, and many others. So you see, I do not know, honourable sir, what you—" Here the Major shrugged his shoulders. "Pardon me. If one regards the matter from the point of view of duty and honour, you will yourself understand." "I understand nothing," answered the nose. "I repeat, please explain yourself more distinctly." "Honourable sir," said Kovalev with dignity, "I do not know how I am to understand your words. It seems to me the matter is as clear as possible. Or do you wish— But you are, after all, my own nose." The nose looked at the Major and wrinkled its forehead. "There you are wrong, respected sir. I am myself. Besides, there can be no close relations between us. To judge by the buttons of your uniform, you must be in quite a different department to mine." So saying, the nose turned away. Kovalev was completely puzzled. He didn't know what to do, and still less what to think. At this moment he heard the pleasant rustling of a lady's dress, and there approached an elderly lady wearing a quantity of lace, and by her side her graceful daughter, in a white dress, which set off her slender figure to advantage, and wearing a light straw hat. Behind the ladies marched a tall lackey with long whiskers. Kovalev advanced a few steps, adjusted his cambric collar, arranged his seals, which hung by a little gold chain, and with a smiling face fixed his eyes on the graceful lady, who bowed lightly like a spring flower, and raised to her brow her little white hand with transparent fingers. He smiled still more when he spied under the brim of her hat her little round chin, and part of her cheek, faintly tinted with rose colour. But suddenly he sprang back as though he had been scorched. He remembered that he had nothing but an absolute blank in place of a nose, and tears started to his eyes. He turned round in order to tell the gentleman in uniform that he was only a state councillor in appearance, but really a scoundrel and a rascal, and nothing else but his own nose. But the nose was no longer there. He had gone, doubtless in order to continue his visits. His disappearance plunged Kovalev into despair. He went back and stood for a moment under a colonnade, looking round him on all sides in hope of perceiving the nose somewhere. He remembered very well that it wore a hat with a plume in it and a gold-embroidered uniform, but he hadn't noticed the shape of the cloak, nor the colour of the carriages and the horse, nor even whether the lackey stood behind it, and, if so, what sort of livery he wore. Moreover, so many carriages were passing that it would have been difficult to recognize one, and even if he had done so, there would have been no means of stopping it. The day was fine and sunny. An immense crowd was passing to and fro in the Nevsky Avenue. A variegated stream of ladies flowed along the pavement. There was his acquaintance, the Privy Councillor, whom he was accustomed to style General, especially when strangers were present. There was Yarygin, his intimate friend, who always lost in the evenings at whist, and there another major, who had obtained the rank of committee-man in the Caucasus, beckoned to him. "Go to the deuce," said Kovalov sotto voce. "Hi, coachman, drive me straight to the superintendent of police." So saying, he got into a droshky and continued to shout all the time to the coachman, "Drive hard!" "Is the police superintendent at home?" he asked on entering the front hall. "No, sir," answered the porter. "He's just gone out." "Ah, just as I thought." "Yes," continued the porter, "he's only just gone out. If you'd been a moment earlier, you would perhaps have caught him." Kovalov, still holding his handkerchief to his face, re-entered the droshky and cried in a despairing voice, "Drive on!" "Where?" asked the coachman. "Straight on." "But how? There are crossroads here. Shall I go to the left or to the right?" This question made Kovalov reflect. In his situation it was necessary to have recourse to the police, not because the affair had anything to do with them directly, but because they acted more promptly than other authorities. As for demanding any explanation from the department to which the nose claimed to belong, it would, he felt, be useless, for the answers of that gentleman showed that he regarded nothing as sacred, and he might just as likely have lied in this matter as in saying that he had never seen Kovalev. But just as he was about to order the coachman to drive to the police station, the idea occurred to him that this rascally scoundrel, who at their first meeting had behaved so disloyally towards him, might, profiting by the delay, quit the city secretly, and then all his searching would be in vain, or might last over a whole month. Finally, as though visited with a heavenly inspiration, he resolved to go directly to an advertisement office and to advertise the loss of his nose, giving all its distinctive characteristics in detail, so that anyone who found it might bring it at once to him, or, at any rate, inform him where it lived. Having decided on this course, he ordered the coachman to drive to the advertisement office, and all the way he continued to punch him in the back. "Quick, scoundrel, quick!" "Yes, sir," answered the coachman, lashing his shaggy horse with the reins. At last they arrived, and Kovalov, out of breath, rushed into a little room where a grey-haired official in an old coat and with spectacles on his nose sat at a table, holding his pen between his teeth, counting a heap of copper coins. "Who takes in the advertisements here?" exclaimed Kovalov. "At your service, sir," answered the grey-haired functionary, looking up and then fastening his eyes again on the heap of coins before him. "I wish to place an advertisement in your paper." "Have the kindness to wait a minute," answered the official, putting down figures on paper with one hand, and with the other moving two balls on his calculating frame. A lackey, whose silver-laced coat showed that he served in one of the houses of the nobility, was standing by the table with a note in his hand, and speaking in a lively tone by way of showing himself sociable. "Would you believe it, sir, this little dog is really not worth 24 kopecks, and for my own part I wouldn't give a farthing for it, but the Countess is quite gone upon it, and offers 100 roubles reward to anyone who finds it. To tell you the truth, the tastes of these people are very different from ours. They don't mind giving 500 or 1,000 roubles for a poodle or a pointer, provided it be a good one." The official listened with a serious air, while counting the numbers of letters contained in the note. At either side of the table stood a number of housekeepers, clerks, and porters carrying notes. The writer of one wished to sell a barouche which had been brought from Paris in 1814, and had been very little used. Others wanted to dispose of a strong droshky which wanted one spring, a spirited horse 17 years old, and so on. The room where these people were collected was very small, and the air was very close. But Kovalov was not affected by it, for he had covered his face with a handkerchief, and because his nose itself was heaven knew where. "Sir, allow me to ask you. I am in a great hurry," he said at last impatiently. In a moment. 2 roubles 24 kopecks. 1 minute. 1 rouble 64 kopecks," said the grey-haired official, throwing their notes back to the housekeepers and porters. "What do you wish?" he said, turning to Kovalov. "I wish," answered the latter. "I have just been swindled, and cheated, and I cannot get hold of the perpetrator. I only want you to insert an advertisement to say that whoever brings this scoundrel to me will be well rewarded. What's your name, please? Why do you want my name? I have many lady friends. Madame Chekhtyriev, wife of a state councillor, Madame Potocina, wife of a colonel. Heaven forbid that they should get to hear of it. You can simply write committee man, or better, major. And the man who has run away is your serf. Serf! If he was, it would not be such a great swindle. It is the nose which has absconded. What a strange name. And this Mr. Nose has stolen from you a considerable sum. Mr. Nose? You don't understand me. It's my own nose which has gone. I don't know where. The devil has played a trick on me. How has it disappeared? I don't understand. I can't tell you how. But the important point is that now it walks about the city itself as a state councillor. That is why I want you to advertise that whoever gets hold of it should bring it as soon as possible to me. Consider, how can I live without such a prominent part of my body? It's not as if it were merely a little toe. I would only have to put my foot in my boot and no one would notice its absence. Every Thursday I call on the wife of Monsieur Chekhtyriev, the state councillor. Madame Potocina, a colonel's wife who has a very pretty daughter, is one of my acquaintances. And what am I to do now? I cannot appear before them like this. The official compressed his lips and reflected. No, I cannot insert an advertisement like that, he said after a long pause. What? Why not? Because it might compromise the paper. Suppose everyone could advertise that his nose was lost. People already say that all sorts of nonsense and lies are inserted. But this isn't nonsense. There is nothing of that sort in my case. You think so? Listen a minute. Last week there was a case very like it. An official came, just as you have done, bringing an advertisement for the insertion of which he paid 2 roubles 63 kopecks, and this advertisement simply announced the loss of a black-haired poodle. There didn't seem to be anything out of the way in it, but it was really a satire. By the poodle was meant the cashier of some establishment or other. But I'm not talking of a poodle, but my own nose, that is, almost myself. No, I cannot insert your advertisement, but my nose really has disappeared. That's a matter for a doctor. There are said to be people who can provide you with any kind of nose you like, but I see that you're a witty man and like to have your joke. But I swear to you on my word of honour, look at my face yourself. Why, put yourself out, continued the official, taking a pinch of snuff. All the same, if you don't mind, he added with a touch of curiosity, I should like to have a look at it. The committee man removed a handkerchief from his face. It certainly does look odd, said the official. It's perfectly flat like a freshly fried pancake. It's hardly credible. Very well. Are you going to hesitate any more? You see, it's impossible to refuse to advertise my loss. I shall be particularly obliged to you, and I shall be glad that this incident has procured me the pleasure of making your acquaintance. The Major, we see, did not even shrink from a slight humiliation. It certainly is not difficult to advertise it, replied the official, but I don't see what good it would do you. However, if you lay so much stress on it, you should apply to someone who has a skilful pen, so that he may describe it as a curious natural freak and publish the article in the Northern Bee. Here he took another pinch. For the benefit of youthful readers, he wiped his nose, or simply as a matter worthy of arousing public curiosity. The committee man felt completely discouraged. He let his eyes fall absent-mindedly on a daily paper in which theatrical performances were advertised. Reading there the name of an actress whom he knew to be pretty, he involuntarily smiled, and his hand sought his pocket to see if he had a blue ticket, for in Kovalev's opinion superior officers like himself should not take a lesser-priced seat. But the thought of his lost nose suddenly spoilt everything. The official himself seemed touched at his difficult position. Desiring to console him, he tried to express his sympathy by a few polite words. "I much regret," he said, "your extraordinary mishap. Will you not try a pinch of snuff? It clears the head, banishes depression, and is a good preventative against hemorrhoids." So saying, he reached his snuff-box out to Kovalev, skilfully concealing at the same time the cover, which was adorned with the portrait of some lady or other. This act, quite innocent in itself, exasperated Kovalev. "I don't understand what you find to joke about in the matter," he exclaimed angrily. "Don't you see that I lack precisely the essential feature for taking snuff? The devil take your snuff-box! I don't want to look at snuff now, not even the best, certainly not your vile stuff." So saying, he left the advertisement office in a state of profound irritation, and went to the commissary of police. He arrived just as this dignity was reclining on his couch and saying to himself with a sigh of satisfaction, "Yes, I shall make a nice little sum out of that." It might be expected, therefore, that the committee-man's visit would be quite inopportune. The police commissary was a great patron of all the arts and industries, but what he liked above everything else was a cheque. "It's a fine thing," he used to say, "to which it is not easy to find an equivalent. It requires no food, it does not take up much room, it stays in one's pocket, and if it falls, it is not broken." The commissary accorded Kovalev a fairly frigid reception, saying that the afternoon was not the best time to come with a case, that nature required one to rest a little after eating. This showed the committee-man that the commissary was acquainted with the aphorisms of the ancient sages, and that respectable people did not have their noses stolen. The last allusion was too direct. We must remember that Kovalev was a very sensitive man. He did not mind anything said against him as an individual, but he could not endure any reflection on his rank or social position. He even believed that in comedies one might allow attacks on junior officers, but never on their seniors. The commissary's reception of him hurt his feelings so much that he raised his head proudly and said with dignity, "After such insulting expressions on your part, I have nothing more to say," and he left the place. He reached his house quite wearied out. It was already growing dark. After all his fruitless search, his room seemed to him melancholy and even ugly. In the vestibule, he saw his valet Ivan stretched on the leather couch and amusing himself by spitting at the ceiling, which he did very cleverly, hitting every time the same spot. His servant's equanimity enraged him. He struck him on the forehead with his hat and said, "You good-for-nothing, you're always playing the fool." Ivan rose quickly and hastened to take off his master's cloak. Once in his room, the major, tired and depressed, threw himself in an armchair and, after sighing a while, began to soliloquize. "In heaven's name, why should such a misfortune befall me? If I had lost an arm or a leg, it would be less insupportable, but a man without a nose! Devil take it, what's he good for? He's only fit to be thrown out of the window. If it had been taken from me in war or in a duel, or if I had lost it by my own fault. But it has disappeared inexplicably. But no, it is impossible," he continued after reflecting a few moments. "It is incredible that a nose can disappear like that. Quite incredible. I must be dreaming or suffering from some hallucination. Perhaps I swallowed, by mistake, instead of water, the brandy with which I rubbed my chin after being shaved. That fool of an Ivan must have forgotten to take it away, and I must have swallowed it." In order to find out whether he were really drunk, the major pinched himself so hard that he involuntarily uttered a cry. The pain convinced him that he was quite wide awake. He walked slowly to the looking-glass, and at first closed his eyes, hoping to see his nose suddenly in its proper place. But on opening them he started back. "What a hideous sight!" he exclaimed. It was really incomprehensible. One might easily lose a button, a silver spoon, a watch, or something similar, But a loss like this, and in one's own dwelling! After considering all the circumstances, Major Kovalev felt inclined to suppose that the cause of all his trouble should be laid at the door of Madame Potocina, the colonel's wife, who wished him to marry her daughter. He himself paid her court readily, but always avoided coming to the point. And when the lady one day told him point blank that she wished him to marry her daughter, he gently drew back, declaring that he was still too young, and that he had to serve 5 years more before he would be 42. This must be the reason why the lady in revenge had resolved to bring him into disgrace, and had hired 2 sorceresses for that object. One thing was certain: his nose had not been cut off. No one had entered his room. And as for Ivan Yakovlevitch, he had been shaved by him on Wednesday, and during that day and the whole of Thursday his nose had been there, as he knew and well remembered. Moreover, if his nose had been cut off, he would naturally have felt pain, and doubtless the wound would not have healed so quickly, nor would the surface have been as flat as a pancake. All kinds of plans passed through his head. Should he bring a legal action against the wife of a superior officer, or should he go to her and charge her openly with her treachery? His reflections were interrupted by a sudden light, which shone through all the chinks of the door, showing that Ivan had lit the wax candles in the vestibule. Soon Ivan himself came in with a light. Kovalev quickly seized a handkerchief and covered the place where his nose had been the evening before, so that his blockhead of a servant might not gape with his mouth wide open when he saw his master's extraordinary appearance. Scarcely had Ivan returned to the vestibule than a stranger's voice was heard there. "Does Major Kovalev live here?" it asked. "Come in," said the major, rising rapidly and opening the door. He saw a police official of pleasant appearance, with grey whiskers and fairly full cheeks, the same who at the commencement of this story was standing at the end of the Isaac Bridge. "You've lost your nose?" he asked. "Exactly so. It has just been found." "What do you say?" stammered Major Kovalev. Joy had suddenly paralysed his tongue. He stared at the police commissary, on whose cheeks and full lips fell the flickering light of the candle. "How was it?" he asked at last. "By a very singular chance. It has been arrested just as it was getting into a carriage for Riga. Its passport had been made out some time ago in the name of an official, and what is still more strange, I myself took it at first for a gentleman. Fortunately, I had my glasses with me, and then I saw at once that it was a nose. I'm short-sighted, you know, and as you stand before me, I can't distinguish your nose, your beard, or anything else. My mother-in-law can hardly see at all." Kovalev was beside himself with excitement. "Where is it? Where? I will hasten there at once." "Don't put yourself out. Knowing that you need it, I brought it with me. Another singular thing is that the principal culprit in the matter is a scoundrel of a barber living in the Ascension Avenue, who is now safely locked up. I had long suspected him of drunkenness and theft. Only the day before yesterday he stole some buttons in a shop. Your nose is quite uninjured." So saying, the police commissary put his hand in his pocket and brought out the nose, wrapped up in paper. Yes, that's it," exclaimed Kovalev. "Will you not stay and drink a cup of tea with me?" "I should like to very much, but I cannot. I must go at once to the House of Correction. The cost of living is very high nowadays. My mother-in-law lives with me, and there are several children. The eldest is very hopeful and intelligent, but I have no means for their education." After the commissary's departure, Kovalev remained for some time plunged in a kind of vague reverie, and did not recover full consciousness for several moments, so great was the effect of this unexpected good news. He placed the recovered nose carefully in the palm of his hand, and examined it again with the greatest attention. "Yes, this is it," he said to himself. "Here's the heat boil on the left side which came out yesterday," and he nearly laughed aloud with delight. But nothing is permanent in this world. Joy in the second moment of its arrival is already less keen than in the first, is still fainter in the third, and finishes by coalescing with our normal mental state, just as the circles which the fall of a pebble forms on the surface of water gradually die away. Kovalev began to meditate, and saw that his difficulties were not yet over. His nose had been recovered, but it had yet to be joined on again in its proper place. And suppose it could not? As he put this question to himself, Kovalev grew pale. With a feeling of indescribable dread, he rushed towards his dressing table and stood before the mirror in order that he might not place his nose crookedly. His hands trembled. Very carefully he placed it where it had been before. Horror! It did not remain there. He held it to his mouth and warmed it a little with his breath, and then placed it there again. But it would not hold. "Hold on, you stupid!" he said. But the nose seemed to be made of wood, and fell back on the table with a strange noise, as though it had been a cork. The Major's face began to twitch feverishly. "Is it possible that it won't stick?" he asked himself, full of alarm. But however often he tried, all his efforts were in vain. He called Ivan and sent him to fetch the doctor who occupied the finest flat in the mansion. This doctor was a man of imposing appearance, who had magnificent black whiskers and a healthy wife. He ate fresh apples every morning and cleaned his teeth with extreme care, using 5 different toothbrushes for 3/4 of an hour daily. The doctor came immediately. After having asked the Major when this misfortune had happened, he raised his chin and gave him a fillip with his finger just where the nose had been, in such a way that the Major suddenly threw back his head and struck the wall with it. The doctor said that didn't matter. Then, making him turn his face to the right, he felt the vacant place and said, Then he made him turn it to the left and did the same. Finally, he again gave him a fillip with his finger, so that the Major started like a horse whose teeth are being examined. After this experiment, the doctor shook his head and said, "No, it can't be done. Rather remain as you are, lest something worse happen. Certainly one could replace it at once, but I assure you the remedy would be worse than the disease." "All very fine, but how am I to go on without a nose?" answered Kovalev. "There's nothing worse than that. How can I show myself with such a villainous appearance? I go into good society, and this evening I'm invited to 2 parties. I know several ladies, Madame Chekhtyriev, the wife of a state councillor, Madame Potocina, although after what she has done. I don't want to have anything to do with her except through the agency of the police. I beg you," continued Kovalev in a supplicating tone, "find some way or other of replacing it, even if it's not quite firm, as long as it holds at all. I can keep it in place sometimes with my hand, whenever there's any risk. Besides, I do not even dance, so that it is not likely to be injured by any sudden movement. As to your fee, be in no anxiety about that. I can well afford it." "Believe me," answered the doctor in a voice which was neither too high nor too low, but soft and almost magnetic, "I do not treat patients from love of gain. That would be contrary to my principles and to my art. It is true that I accept fees, but that is only not to hurt my patients' feelings by refusing them. I could certainly replace your nose, but I assure you on my word of honour it would only make matters worse. Rather let nature do her own work. Wash the place often with cold water, and I assure you that even without a nose you will be just as well as if you had one. As to the nose itself, I advise you to have it preserved in a bottle of spirits, or still better, of warm vinegar mixed with 2 spoonfuls of brandy, and then you can sell it at a good price. I would be willing to take it myself, provided you do not ask too much." No, I shall not sell it at any price. I would rather it were lost again." "Excuse me," said the doctor, taking his leave. "I hoped to be useful to you, but I can do nothing more. You are at any rate convinced of my good will." So saying, the doctor left the room with a dignified air. Kovalev did not even notice his departure. Absorbed in a profound reverie, He only saw the edge of his snow-white cuffs emerging from the sleeves of his black coat. The next day he resolved, before bringing a formal action, to write to the colonel's wife, and to see whether she would not return to him, without further dispute, that of which she had deprived him. The letter ran as follows. To Madame Alexandra Potocina. I cannot understand this strange behaviour on your part. You can be sure, though, that it won't get you anywhere, and you certainly won't force me to marry your daughter. Moreover, you can rest assured that regarding my nose, I am familiar with the whole history of this affair from the very beginning, and I also know that you and no one else are the prime instigator. Its sudden detachment from its rightful place, its subsequent flight, its masquerading as a civil servant, and then its reappearance in its natural state, are nothing else than the result of black magic, carried out by yourself, or by those practising the same very honourable art. I consider it my duty to warn you that if the above-mentioned nose is not back in its proper place by today, then I shall be compelled to ask for the law's protection. I remain, dear madam, your very faithful servant, Platon Kovalyov. Dear Mr. Kovalyov, I was simply staggered by your letter. To be honest, I never expected anything of this kind from you, particularly those remarks which are quite uncalled for. I would have you know that I have never received that civil servant mentioned by you in my house, whether disguised or not. True, Philip Ivanovitch Potachikov used to call, although he wanted to ask for my daughter's hand, and despite the fact that he was a very sober, respectable, and learned gentleman, I never gave him any cause for hope. If, then, you go on to mention your nose, if by this you mean to say I wanted to make you look foolish, that is, to put you off with a formal refusal, then all I can say is that I am very surprised that you can talk like this, as you know well enough my feelings on the matter are quite different. And if you care to make an official proposal to my daughter, I will gladly give my consent, for this has always been my dearest wish. And in this hope I remain at your disposal. Yours sincerely, Alexandra Potochin. No, said Kovalyov when he had read the letter. She's not to blame. Impossible. A guilty person could never write a letter like that. The Collegiate Assessor knew what he was talking about in this case, as he had been sent to the Caucasus several times to carry out legal inquiries. How on earth did this happen, then? It's impossible to make head or tail of it, he said, letting his arms drop to his side. Meanwhile, rumours about the strange occurrence had spread throughout the capital, not, need we say, without a few embellishments. At the time, everyone seemed very preoccupied with the supernatural. Only a short time before, some experiments in magnetism had been all the rage. Besides, the story of the dancing chairs in Konusheny Street was still fresh in people's minds, so no one was particularly surprised to hear about Collegiate Assessor Kolyakov's nose taking a regular stroll along the Nevsky Avenue at exactly 3 o'clock every afternoon. Every day crowds of inquisitive people flocked there. Someone said they had seen the nose in Junker's store, and this produced such a crush outside that the police had to be called. One fairly respectable-looking, bewhiskered character, who sold stale cakes outside the theatre, knocked together some solid-looking wooden benches and hired them out at 80 kopecks a time for people to stand on. One retired colonel left home especially early one morning, and after a great struggle managed to barge his way through to the front. But to his great annoyance, instead of a nose in the shop window, all he could see was an ordinary woolen jersey and a lithograph showing a girl adjusting her stocking, while a dandy with a small beard and a cutaway waistcoat peered out at her from behind a tree. A picture which had hung there in that identical spot for more than 10 years. He left feeling very cross, and was heard to say, "Misleading the public with such ridiculous and far-fetched stories shouldn't be allowed." Afterwards, it was rumoured that Major Kovalev's nose was no longer to be seen strolling along the Nevsky Avenue, but was in the habit of walking in Tavrichesky Park, and that it had been doing this for a long time. When Khosrov Mirza lived there, he was astonished at this freak of nature. Some of his students from the College of Surgeons went to have a look. One well-known, very respectable lady wrote specially to the head park-keeper, asking him to show her children this very rare phenomenon, and, if possible, give them an instructive and edifying commentary at the same time. These events came as a blessing to those socialites, indispensable for any successful party, who loved amusing the ladies and whose stock of stories was completely exhausted at the time. A few respectable and high-minded citizens were very upset. One indignant gentleman said that he was at a loss to understand how such absurd cock-and-bull stories could gain currency in the present enlightened century, and that the complete indifference shown by the authorities was past comprehension. Clearly this gentleman was the type who likes to make the government responsible for everything, even their daily quarrels with their wives. And afterwards, but here again, the whole incident becomes enveloped in mist, and what happens later remains a complete mystery. 3. The world is full of the most outrageous nonsense. Sometimes things happen which you would hardly think possible. That very same nose, which had paraded itself as a state councillor and created such an uproar in the city, suddenly turned up as if nothing had happened, plonk where it had been before, that is, right between Major Kovalev's two cheeks. This was on the 7th of April. He woke up and happened to glance in the mirror. There was his nose. He grabbed it with his hands to make sure, but there was no doubt this time. "Aha!" cried Kovalev, and if Ivan hadn't come in at that very moment, he would have joyfully danced the trepak round the room in his bare feet. He ordered some soap and water, and as he washed himself looked into the mirror again. The nose was there. He had another look as he dried himself. Yes, the nose was still there. "Look, Ivan, I think I've got a pimple on my nose." Kovalev thought, God, supposing he replied, "Not only is there no pimple, but no nose either." But Ivan answered, "Your nose is quite all right, sir. I can't see any pimple." "Thank God for that," the Major said to himself, and clicked his fingers. At this moment, Ivan Yakovlevitch the barber poked his head round the corner, but timidly this time, like a cat which had just been beaten for stealing fat. "Before you start, are your hands clean?" Kovalev shouted from the other side of the room. "Perfectly clean." "You're lying." "On my life, sir, they're clean." Let's have a look then." Kovalev sat down. Ivan Yakovlevitch covered him with a towel, and in a twinkling had transformed his whole beard and part of his cheeks into the kind of cream served up at merchants' birthday parties. "Well, I'll be damned," Ivan Yakovlevitch muttered to himself, staring at the nose. He bent Kovalev's head to one side and looked at him from a different angle. "That's it, all right. You'd never credit it." He continued and contemplated the nose for a long time. Finally, ever so gently, with a delicacy that the reader can best imagine, he lifted two fingers to hold the nose by its tip. This was how Ivan Yakovlevitch normally shaved his customers. "Come on now and mind my nose," shouted Kovalev. Ivan Yakovlevitch let his arms fall to his side and stood there, more frightened and embarrassed than he had ever been in his life. At last he started tickling Kovalev carefully under the chin with his razor. Shaving presented a peculiar challenge for him, as he only had his olfactory organ, his nose, to rely on for stability. With no other means of support, he resorted to an unconventional method by planting his rough, wrinkled thumb on his cheek and lower gum to gain some leverage. Despite the unorthodox approach, he successfully managed to shave Kovalev using this technique. When everything was ready, Kovalev rushed to get dressed and took a cab straight to the cafe. He had hardly got inside before he shouted, "Waiter, a cup of chocolate," and went straight up to the mirror. Yes, his nose was there. Gaily he turned round, screwed up his eyes, and looked superciliously at two soldiers, one of whom had a nose no bigger than a waistcoat button. Then he went off to the ministerial department, where he was petitioning for a vice-governorship. Failing for this, he was going to try for an administrative post. As he crossed the entrance hall, he had another look in the mirror. His nose was still there. Then he went to see another collegiate assessor, or major, a great wag whose sly digs Kovalev used to counter by saying, "I'm used to your quips now, you old niggler." On the way he thought, if the major doesn't split his sides when he sees me, that's a sure sign that everything is in its proper place. But the collegiate assessor did not pass any remarks. That's all right then, damn it, thought Kovalev. In the street he met Mrs. Potochin, the staff officer's wife, who was with her daughter, and they replied to his bow with delighted exclamations. Clearly he had suffered no lasting injury. He had a long chat with them, making a point of taking out of his snuff-box, and stood there for ages, ostentatiously stuffing both nostrils, as he murmured to himself, "That'll teach you, you old hens, and I'm not going to marry your daughter simply par amour, as they say, if you don't mind." And from that time onwards, Major Kovalev was able to stroll along the Nevsky Avenue, visit the theatre, in fact, go everywhere as though absolutely nothing had happened. And as though absolutely nothing had happened, his nose stayed in the middle of his face and showed no signs of wandering off. After that he was in perpetual high spirits, always smiling, chasing all the pretty girls, and on one occasion even stopping at a small shop in the Gostiny Dvor to buy ribbon for some medal, no one knows why, as he didn't belong to any order of knighthood. And all this took place in the northern capital of our vast empire. Only now, after much reflection, can we see that there is a great deal that is very far-fetched in this story. Apart from the fact that it's highly unlikely for a nose to disappear in such a fantastic way, and then reappear in various parts of the town dressed as a state councillor, it is hard to believe that Kovalev was so ignorant as to think newspapers would accept advertisements about noses. I'm not saying I consider such an advertisement too expensive and a waste of money. That's nonsense. And what's more, I don't think I'm a mercenary person. But it's all very nasty, not quite the thing at all, and it makes me feel very awkward. And come to think of it, how did the nose manage to turn up in a loaf of bread? And how did Ivan Yakovlevich? No, I don't understand it, not one bit. But the strangest, most incredible thing of all is that authors should write about such things. That, I confess, is beyond my comprehension. It's just, no, I don't understand it at all. Firstly, it's no use to the country whatsoever. Secondly, it's no use. I simply don't know what one can make of it. However, when all is said and done, one can concede this point or the other, and perhaps you can even find, well, then, you won't find much that isn't on the absurd side, will you? And yet, if you stop to think for a moment, there's a grain of truth in it. Whatever you may say, these things do happen. Rarely, I admit, but they do happen. So that was The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. I will tell you something about him and about the story, which was published in 1836. In a nutshell, it is an absurd story which uses, and Gogol was groundbreaking in this, uses the absurdity of the situation to poke fun at the absurdity of Russian society and its stratification at that time. That's it. That's what the story's about. There's lots more to say, but that's it in a nutshell. So Nikolai Gogol was a prominent Russian writer born on March 31st, 1809 in Sorochinsky, Ukraine. Gogol's early life was marked by financial struggles, and he faced challenges pursuing his literary ambitions. He gained recognition for his early works such as Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, which showcased his unique blend of realism and humour. Humour is important in all of Gogol's work. So later Gogol moved to St. Petersburg, where he became involved in the city's literary circles and befriended influential figures like Alexander Pushkin. Gogol's career flourished with the publication of his acclaimed novel Dead Souls, and that's probably the book he's most known for, which satirized Russian society and bureaucracy. His works often delved into themes of identity, social class, and the absurdities of human nature. Gogol's writings combined elements of fantasy and grotesque realism, containing, I think we see that exactly in this story, creating a distinctive style that influenced later writers. Despite struggling with personal and health issues, his legacy endures. He died in Moscow in 1852 when he was only 42. This story, The Nose, was originally published in 1836. I think, depending on which calendar you use, it may be 1835. It was in a collection called Mirgorod, and of short stories. It was popular because of its absurd and surreal narrative, which was very fresh at the time, exploring themes of identity, society, and the supernatural in a satirical manner. That's the collection. There's not much supernatural in this story, although you could say it is supernatural for a nose to go missing and then wandering around the town and then reappear. And ending up beginning in a loaf of bread, in fact, as well. So it's set in St. Petersburg, the bustling streets of St. Petersburg, and we have Collegiate Assessor Kovalev as he awakens one morning to find his nose mysteriously missing. In fact, it begins with the drunken barber, Ivan Yakovlevich, who fancies a piece of bread that his wife's baked, and finds a nose in it, and she blames him. She baked the bread, but he takes the blame. And he believes and he recognises the nose instantly. It must have been a very distinctive nose, much like my own, and knows who it is. And then, as a guilty person, tries to get rid of the evidence and fails, of course. St. Petersburg. So, two historical things. At this time in the 1830s, Russia was undergoing significant social and cultural changes. I think it was Tsar Nicholas I was introducing reforms. I remember doing Russian history, and I really, really, really liked it. I liked Russian history. There we are. I'm not sure the Russians enjoyed the history as much as I enjoyed it. But so and then before that, there was a thing that Peter the Great in 1722 issued the Table of Ranks, which stratified Russian society into 14 distinct ranks across military, civil, and court service. And if you read Russian literature of that period, it can be quite, the ranks are really important. And he can call himself a major, even though he's a collegiate inspector, because the ranks they have equivalents across society. So it says, this system, while ostensibly meritocratic, often reinforced existing class divisions, became a focal point for social ambition and status anxiety. So it's not just a modern thing, that. So also St. Petersburg's important because it was founded in 1703 as a new city to be the window on the West, to be a perfect Western European city. On one of the times, Russia kind of dilly-dallies between, and sometimes it isn't allowed to be a European. I don't mean dilly-dallies, I mean flip-flops. So, and this was a period when it wanted to be European. St. Petersburg was founded by Peter the Great, and lots of European, French, Scots even, all sorts of Europeans went and helped build the city, and it was going to be the perfect. And of course, it was the perfect city, whereas much of Russia languished in poverty and bad times. Whereas St. Petersburg was supposed to be this, window on the West. Yeah, I just said that. I was saying something about the Russians then, and I've no right to talk about politics, but this is what I always think about the Russians, because remember I studied Russian history. I even studied a bit of Russian a long time ago in the 80s. But it always struck me that Russia has a really important part to play in European history. It has a very big role, and always has had. If you think about it, Russia, I'm not, and this isn't me saying it's great for the Russians to go and invade other countries. I don't think it is. But Russia, there would be no Europe if it wasn't for Russia. Russia prevented or wore down the Mongols and the Huns and people like that. The Mongols particularly, Genghis Khan, all that. Then Napoleon, and then Hitler. So three great tyrannical forces that wanted to rip Europe apart were defeated by the Russians. So I think they deserve a bit of credit for that. That isn't to, they've had a terrible history as well. So, and they have great culture, they have great literature. And that does not mean in any sense that I'm a supporter of any Russian tyrannical regime, the Soviet regime, or I'm not much of a fan of Putin either, to be fair. But they don't represent Russia, Anyway, there we are. So let's look at the story itself. So the use of surrealism and absurdity in the nose serves as a potent vehicle for his social critique. The central conceit, a nose that detaches itself from its own and assumes a life of its own, immediately plunges the reader into a world where the boundaries between the rational and irrational are blurred. And this is newish, This inexplicable occurrence sets the stage for, especially in a humorous way, this inexplicable occurrence sets a stage for a series of increasingly absurd events. So it becomes a high-ranking official, higher ranking than the man, and this really bothers him. And it has all the trappings, the absurd trappings, an ornate uniform, a carriage, which is saying really how ludicrous these ranks are. A nose, a disembodied nose, can achieve them through what merit can a nose have? And the absurdity of it all, and the surrealist, the humour of it, allows, it distorts and exaggerates the already absurd social divisions and pokes fun at them, reductio ad absurdum, really. And we are tourists looking in on this, but for his contemporaries, this was real. This was, a very pointed critique of the life they were living, and also, maybe saying, look, wake up, come on. So a disembodied nose can navigate and excel within the rigid class system simply by donning the right uniform. The bureaucratic inefficiency and indifference of institutions are lampooned through Kovalev's futile attempts to seek help from the police and newspaper office, the police commissioner's dismissive attitude, and the newspaper clerk's refusal to print an advertisement about the missing nose highlight the absurdity and ineffectiveness of these supposedly authoritative bodies. And if Gogol mocks society's fixation on outward appearance and stateless status symbols, Kovalev's preoccupation with his rank, his exaggerated courtesies towards those he perceives as superiors, and his horror at being seen without his nose, all serve to satirize the superficiality of these social interactions. But they stick to them, don't they? So the nose, to lose your nose symbolizes a loss of face, as we say. The Russians may even say loss of nose, both literally and figuratively in society where appearance is paramount, and clothing and appearance play a crucial symbolic role. It's all about being seen, isn't it? You can't go out with this seen. People would see it. The other theme that I picked up in my research is the theme of alienation in urban society, reflecting the broader anxieties about modernization and identity in 19th century Russian. St. Petersburg emerges as a labyrinthine metropolis, yeah, that's the one, where the individual is easily swallowed up by the masses. The city's bustling streets, with a constant flow of carriages and pedestrians, create a sense of anonymity and disconnection. The urban landscape is juxtaposed against an indifferent bureaucracy. Also, perhaps this urbanization, and if you come from a traditional society, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows whose fathers whose sisters who married who, what they do. And that gives you a place. When you move to a city, you don't have a place. And so these ranks serve as a new way of... We're very hierarchical creatures, We're always concerned about our place in society, who we are, what deference we should be given. It's if you don't have any, it's not a big problem. But if you are the daughter of, the son of, the father of, then you, in a traditional society, you gain kudos and status through that. Well, the table of ranks was a way of recreating that in an urban society, really, in a bigger, certainly in the Russian Empire, a bigger society than the traditional. So I think that is important. We also need to say something about his narrative technique. So this absurdism, surrealism, was revolutionary for the time, and it anticipates the modernist and postmodernist approaches to storytelling 200 years later, nearly. The unreliable narrator is a cornerstone of his technique. Unlike the normal omniscient narrators common in 19th century literature, Gogol's narrator repeatedly undermines his own authority. He starts a story on the 25th of March. A very strange occurrence took place, and it sets a tone of uncertainty and invites skepticism. He further erodes his credibility by saying how it happened. It's impossible to say. But here, the incident becomes totally shrouded in mist. So this is the guy who's telling you the story. He doesn't even know what's happening. And this is a radical technique for its time. So he blends realism and fantasy. This is early. He employs, what my notes say, what Viktor Shklovsky would later determine defamiliarization, making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. There's an echo of Freud in that. The detailed realistic descriptions of St. Petersburg are juxtaposed with absurd events, creating cognitive dissonance that heightens the satirical effect. For example, the matter-of-fact description of Ivan Yakovlevich finding a nose in his bread is presented with the same straightforward tone as his mundane morning routine. It uses a technique, so my notes say, akin to cinematic montage, rapidly shifting between scenes and perspectives. This is evident in the quick transitions from Ivan Yakovlevich's discovery of the nose to Kovalev's realization of its absence, to the nose's own adventures in the city. This fragmented storytelling creates a sense of disorientation that mirrors Kovalev's own confused state. Gogol's use of skaz, a narrative technique that imitates the oral speech of a simple narrator, is particularly innovative. The colloquial tone and digressions mimic casual conversation. You remember, in early literature, everybody in Victorian literature, this is early for that, they all spoke on this higher register, where, of course, Gogol is actually using colloquial language of the ordinary man, and it's more realistic speech. The abrupt ending of the story is a masterful subversion of narrative conventions. Rather than providing resolution or explanation, Gogol leaves the central mystery unsolved. The nose's sudden reappearance and the quick return to normalcy create a circular structure that questions the very nature of reality and social norms. The narrator's final assertion that such incidents do happen in the world, rarely, but they do happen, is a brilliant piece of metafiction challenging the boundaries between reality and fiction. These narrative techniques collectively create what Mikhail Bakhtin would later term carnivalesque, a literary mode that subverts and liberates the assumptions of the dominant style or atmosphere through humour and chaos. By destabilizing reality and undermining narrative authority, Gogol creates a textual world that reflects the absurdities and contradictions of the social world that he critiques. So, what about its place in European literature? So, you've got, he's a friend of Pushkin's, the romantic tradition exemplified by Pushkin. Pushkin's The Bronze Horseman, 1833, 3 or 2 years, depending on the calendar, before this used fantastical elements to explore themes of individual versus the state. But Gogol's approach is more radical in its absurdism and social satire. In later Russian literature, you can see the influence in Dostoevsky's The Double, Dvoynik, 1846, 10 years after, echoes the nose in its exploration of fractured identity and bureaucratic alienation, with the protagonist Golyadkin's descent into madness mirroring Kovalev's frantic search for the nose. Much later, century and a bit later, Mikhail Bulgakov's fantastic book, The Master and Margarita. I read it many years ago. I must reread it. I loved it. 1967 directly references the nose when a character's head is separated from his body, maintaining the blend of the fantastical and the mundane. Vladimir Nabokov's The Eye, 1930, so 2 centuries after, employs a similarly unreliable narrator and explores themes of identity in a surreal context, clearly influenced by Gogol's technique. And in European literature, you have E.T.A. Hoffmann. I did one of his stories, The Sandman, and he uses a fantastical as well in German literature. But you think about Kafka's The Metamorphosis, 1915, so nearly 100 years, 80-odd, shares with the nose the sudden unexplained transformation of the protagonist and the matter-of-fact treatment of the absurd, both using this device to critique social norms and bureaucratic systems. In magical realism, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, 1955, employs a similar technique of presenting the fantastical in a mundane setting. The theatre of the absurd, exemplified by Ionesco's Rhinoceros, 1959, shares with the nose the use of absurd situations to critique society. And it's worth mentioning those, even though they are up to hundreds of years after Gogol's The Nose. He kind of made it doable, made it allowable. He gave a precedent, is what I'm trying to say. So this juxtaposition of the absurd and the real, given to you by somebody who you don't know whether you can trust, and you don't know whether you should laugh at them as if they're pulling your leg or not, because the narrator is unreliable. It seems that this was massively influential, particularly on Russian literature later, but also on other European literature. We've just seen Kafka, Marquez, and, well, I say Western literature really, and Ionesco. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. It's a classic story. It is, if you need to know about the history, or if you want to say something about the history of the short story, particularly in Western literature, this is one of the stories you've got to do. So I hope you enjoyed it.